Welcome back after lunch on the second day of the Proof of Work Summit at Spark here in Frankfurt, brought to you by our sponsors Hive, Citrea, Block Scout, Logos, Rootstock, and Evertos, and an amazing public that's having great cross-cultural and cross-tribal conversations, reaffirming the thesis of Proof of Work Summit that we better punch up instead of punch sideways. Thank all of you for participating in this. Now I'd like to introduce one of the OGs in the space, Mr. Phil Zimmermann, the inventor of Pretty Good Privacy, PGP, who went through a long legal battle with the United States government to establish code as speech, who's going to be discussing with you today the challenge that we face with autocrats as this noose tightens around our ability to transact and communicate with each other. Please welcome Mr. Phil Zimmermann to the stage.
Okay. I spoke here last year, but the audience is mostly different. So there may be a little bit of overlap from last year's topic, which was mostly historical storytelling. But I only got 25 minutes, and I keep adding more topics to this, and so I feel like I'm packing 5 pounds of sugar in a 2-pound bag to cram more topics in this tiny time frame. So let's see if I can talk really fast. You know, they have those sliders on, YouTube. You can talk 25% faster if you click this here. So maybe I'll try to emulate that. So one thing that's come out of another topic I wanted to add to this, which I wasn't planning to do, was to talk more about the carbon footprint stuff, which lots of people have talked about earlier today. Do I just push this green button to advance slides? Okay. So let's see, there it is, okay. It's kind of interesting to see where exactly are we on this timeline. I used to think we were in the oops part, but I'm not so sure now. I think it's a little further than that. First I want to spend like 5 minutes on this idea that's been spinning around in my head this morning, is that if there was some way that Bitcoin miners could insert a little assertion in the output that, the block that they output to put on the blockchain, a declaration of where they got the electricity. Now, yes, they could lie, but if they lied about it and said, oh yeah, we got it from stranded energy, then eventually someone would out them, because the truth will eventually come out. And if there was a declaration of where I got the energy for this mining, the invisible hand of the free market might figure out some way to reward them. I don't know what that mechanism would be exactly, but I don't need to solve that problem to make the point that there's some advantage to try to get the system to start using that approach. You know, we have an old saying that, if we had ham, we could have ham and eggs, if we had eggs. And so you think you're not really incentivized to try to get your hands on some ham if you want ham and eggs, because you don't have any eggs, so why bother to try to get the ham? The same is true about the eggs. Why should I need to get the eggs? I don't have the ham, so we still can't have ham and eggs. But if we had a mechanism for Bitcoin miners to say where they got the energy and to put that in the block that they output, and maybe we could figure out some way to audit them or something to, in other words, build a reputation that did they speak the truth? Did they really get the energy from where they said? You know, maybe a few bytes that declare, I got this much from the grid, I got this much from stranded energy, I got this much from solar, whatever. Then maybe the free market could figure out a way to make use of that information that would incentivize more Bitcoin miners to try to follow, try to move further in the direction of not contributing as much to climate change. So that's my little 5-minute idea. I've been talking with people who gave talks earlier today about related topics. And so that wasn't going to be my talk today because I don't know enough about that to actually give a talk. But I do have this funny slide. In the past 5 years, we've seen a number of governments start to push back on end-to-end encryption. And the reason why they're doing it is because many years ago, WhatsApp had 1 billion users, and they weren't using any encryption at all. And they made a deal to license some software from Signal, and they inserted the Signal protocol into WhatsApp. And overnight, with a single software update from the App Store or from the Google Play Store, suddenly 1 billion people had end-to-end encrypted communications. And that was quite a shock. And in the years since then, that number has grown to a couple billion. And law enforcement was unprepared, I guess. The way they've reacted to it indicates that it was quite a shock to them. And so they're starting to push back because it used to be that only technically sophisticated criminals would make use of strong cryptography, and those numbers were small enough that law enforcement didn't get all upset about it. But now, a couple billion people with no technical background can have end-to-end encryption. I mean, I don't advocate using WhatsApp. I would never use WhatsApp because it's owned by Facebook, and Facebook is in the metadata business, and so I don't want to let WhatsApp anywhere near my devices. I do use Signal. It's a good product. I also use my product, Silent Phone, from Silent Circle, which in my opinion is even better. But I don't use WhatsApp. But WhatsApp does have end-to-end encryption. And that's why governments, a number of governments, are pressing this new policy idea. It's new now, but it wasn't really new because we had to fight them for the entire decade of the 1990s. And, to allow us to use strong encryption, and we won that after a decade of struggle. And I thought that was the end of it. I thought we were done. We won. Don't need to worry about that anymore. But now we see them pushing back. And in my opinion, this is dangerous for national security. All across Europe, telcos have deployed network infrastructure made in China, from Huawei mostly. And that network infrastructure is 5G. I mean, 5G is a great technology. I don't have anything against 5G. Not if you buy it from some other vendor, maybe a European vendor, a US vendor, but not a Chinese vendor, because Huawei was founded by the Chinese military. And Chinese law requires them to provide assistance to Chinese intelligence. And so countries that have deployed their entire network infrastructure, all made in China, and in some cases operated by the Chinese, that's a terrible risk because the whole of society is affected. Government ministries will use it. Banks will use it. Commercial companies, tech companies, defense contractors, government ministries, they all use it. And that gives the Chinese signals intelligence capabilities comparable to the NSA. Now you might say, well, we all hate the NSA, right? I want to remind you that the NSA is from a NATO ally. And right now, there's a hot war in Europe. And NATO is protecting Europe, the rest of Europe. In particular, Article 5, which says that if one NATO country is attacked, all NATO allies should react as if they were attacked. And that's a good thing. And the US is part of NATO, and so are the Brits, and, you know, the NATO intel agencies. I spent the 90s pushing back against the NSA because it was the nature of the struggle of the 90s to give us the ability to use strong encryption. But today, I don't see the NSA, especially in how they're doing their job in Ukraine. I like what they're doing in Ukraine. And so, you know, we need to protect our communications infrastructure from the Chinese. The Chinese are friendly with Russia. If the Chinese can use their signals intelligence capability that comes with all the telcos buying their equipment, they're going to possibly help the Russians. And that's a bad thing. From a national security perspective, we should never allow law enforcement to win that argument. Law enforcement is looking at it from the point of view of law enforcement. They have a job to do, and they're trying to optimize everything for making their job easier. But their job is not the only job. Their mission is not the only mission. We also have to protect ourselves from this hot war spreading into other European countries. We need to have end-to-end encryption. If you're using a communication network controlled by a potential adversary, you better be using end-to-end encryption. First time I visited Ukraine, I think that was right after the Orange Revolution. It was before the Russians took Crimea. And I talked with a Ukrainian military guy, and I said, what would happen if Russia attacked your country? And he said, well, we would lose immediately. And, you know, their military at that time was very weak. And so their military today is much better. But back then it was quite weak. But he said it isn't just the hardware and the tanks and the artillery. It's also the fact that all the Ukrainian military radios, battlefield radios, were built by Russians. Our military is equipped with communication equipment made by Russia. And that would be a terrible disadvantage on the battlefield. Now, of course, they don't use radios made by Russia today. But that was back about 15 years ago. And so we're kind of taking the same risk when we use 5G infrastructure made by China. We should try to swap that out with equipment made in Europe or made in the US, but not made by China. And as long as we're still stuck with that, and a lot of the Western European governments are trying to make that migration. They're trying to replace the Chinese equipment with European vendors' equipment. That's good, but that takes a long time. In the meantime, we need end-to-end encryption to try to mitigate that risk. So from a national security perspective, we should not let law enforcement put in back doors. It kind of feels good to make that argument because during the 90s, I kept on debating people that tried to hit me over the head with the national security argument. And I feel pretty good about hitting them over the head with the national security argument. The reason why they have this attitude about trying to limit our access to strong encryption is because of what happened in World War II. At Bletchley Park, thousands of people worked day and night on breaking the encrypted communications of the Germans and the Japanese. And it was highly secret. And the story has been told and retold many times in historical stories and movies. The most famous movie is The Imitation Game. Perhaps some of you have seen that. How many people saw that film? Okay. You know, for a crowd that is into cryptocurrencies, I would have thought there would be a few more hands that would have seen that film. But anyway, the work that they did at Bletchley Park shortened the war by a couple of years and saved millions of lives, not only in the European theater, but in the Japanese theater. The US, the Battle of Midway, the Japanese tried to ambush the US naval forces. They thought they could sink the US aircraft carriers by a surprise attack, but because we were able to read their encrypted traffic, we surprised them. We ambushed them, and we sank a number of Japanese aircraft carriers, and that was a turning point in the military balance in the Pacific. That shortened that war in the Pacific by a couple of years. So at the end of the war, the US and Britain recognized that there was a tremendous advantage in being able to decrypt the encrypted communications of their enemies. And so they had this attitude, and I think it's a reasonable attitude given the time. You know, if I was alive back then, I would have agreed with that idea that, yeah, you need to have that ability. But if you fast forward to the 1990s, the government still had that attitude. They still thought it was important to be able to decrypt the encrypted communications of their enemies. In fact, after World War II, they took a lot of captured Enigma machines from Germany and sold them to governments of, third world governments and said, here, use this machine for your diplomatic communications. It was invented by the Germans, so it's really good. You should use it. Not telling them that they knew how to break it. So they kept doing that until the 1970s. And so they held on to that attitude up until the beginning of the 90s. And so when PGP came out, they tried to put me in prison for that because of that attitude. They had laws on the books that said that strong encryption is classified as a munition because they saw it in military terms because of World War II. And it was time for them to wake up and smell the coffee. It was the 1990s. It was the internet. When they initially formed that attitude in the 1940s and 50s, there was only a couple of computers in the world. But now we walk around with computers in our pockets. We don't have enough pockets to hold all the computers we have. And, if you want to have a complex technical society, conduct e-commerce and move much of our lives to the digital world, we need strong encryption. So it was time to change, and that's what the 1990s crypto wars were about. That's what PGP was about. And so they finally gave up, and in 2000, ended their export controls. That's the US. The French had domestic controls, and they gave those up a couple of years earlier. The reason why they gave up their domestic controls in France is because they were envious of the commercial economic surge that the Americans were enjoying in the American computer industry because of the growth of the internet. The French were relying on an ancient fossil technology, Minitel. They had these crazy little special purpose terminals that people had in their homes so they could order a pizza. And the French knew that they had to get, with the modern internet. And the only way that they could enjoy that economic success was to reduce their domestic controls on encryption. They never had the export controls, so that wasn't a big issue with them. The British had both. The British had both domestic and export controls, and they backed off too. And those were the three countries. This triumvirate of the United States, Britain, and France were the sort of leaders in this policy about encryption software. The US had only export controls with no domestic controls, but the FBI was attempting to impose domestic controls with the Clipper chip. How many people here have heard of the Clipper chip? Ah, we have more hands. Some of you haven't seen The Imitation Game, but you've heard of the Clipper chip. That's good. It's funny. The story of the Clipper chip is that AT&T created this wonderful product, the AT&T 3600, and it did DES encryption, the Federal Data Encryption Standard, which had a 56-bit key, which is far too small by today's standards. And it did a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and you attach it to your phone, and it had a modem also, and you'd call someone else's phone. And then when you're talking to them on a normal phone line, like always, and you say, okay, let's go secure, and then you push a button, and this makes the modems train up. Then it does now you're on a digital channel, then it does a Diffie-Hellman exchange to work out the key agreement, and then it uses that key to encrypt with the data encryption standard. Well, NSA went out and bought every one of those AT&T 3600s, bought the entire stock. They didn't want anyone to buy them. AT&T thought that was nice. They sold them all overnight. But the NSA said, we would like you to replace that DES chip with this other chip. It's called the Clipper chip. We want you to, you can still make this product. And the Clipper chip is better because the key's 80 bits long, not 56 bits, so it's a superior encryption algorithm. Only problem is, the Clipper chip put a special packet at the beginning of the call that was encrypting the session key with this special key that was baked into the chip. All the Clipper chips had a unique key put in them in the factory. And these were copied into a massive database for the FBI, for wiretap purposes. So it was definitely a Big Brother inside product. And the free market did not respond well to that. For some mysterious reason, people didn't want to buy a product that had a backdoor for the FBI. Can't imagine why they had that attitude. And the FBI was pretty upset about it. They were so upset that the FBI director said to Congress that if the free market doesn't buy this product, the FBI will have no choice but to seek legislative relief. That sounds ominous. Well, the free market won. No amount of legislation, no amount of legislative relief could change the fact that no one wanted to buy this product. I actually bought a couple of them on eBay a few years back. They looked the same as the original, except that they had a different chip in it. I actually opened it up and looked inside just in case. I just wanted to see, is it possible that maybe they didn't buy all of them? Maybe there's still a few with some DES chips in it? No, it had a Clipper chip in it. But actually, the Clipper chip was better then, because of the collapse of the key escrow idea. It's called key escrow when they had this key stored in a database. That was called key escrow. Because there was a total rejection of the Clipper chip in the free market, the database never got off the ground. So my sort of collector's item pair of AT&T 3600s would actually be a reasonable product today because it had an 80-bit key, which is still not big enough, but it was a good encryption algorithm with a reasonable key size. The Diffie-Hellman key was still too small, but anyway, I'm digressing. I said I was going to try to talk faster, but I've wasted a lot of time telling the story about the Clipper chip, which wasn't my idea. I tend to do these talks without notes, so that means I digress. Only got a minute left. I was asked to talk about the Telegram affair. And, the guy who runs Telegram, Durov, was arrested in France, I don't know, a month ago. And, the question is why. And if you read the French indictment, they cite some French laws about asking him to take stuff down that was posted, and he didn't do it, and so, technically, it violated French law. But I can't help but think that there's a geopolitical context here. Because, again, there's a hot war in Europe. And the Russians use Telegram a lot. They use it for calling in artillery strikes on the battlefield. NATO would like to know how to read that traffic. Now, the French indictment against him didn't mention any of that, but I can't help but think that there might be some other larger context to this situation that isn't spelled out in the indictment. I don't have any evidence for this, but this is what my gut tells me. That's about all I can say, because I don't have any hard facts other than what you already read in the press. By the way, I guess I need to show the other slide here. Going back to the earlier point, all this pressure we're seeing right now to put backdoors in end-to-end encryption is kind of like this. It's either anti-terrorism or protect kids. That's, the all-purpose excuse for putting backdoors in strong cryptography. And I think that law enforcement should just put some more elbow grease in doing their jobs, because we need the national security protection that end-to-end encryption gives us. This isn't my Bitcoin wallet, this is just my website. So I think I'm running out of time according to the timer. In fact, it says I'm already a minute and a half late. Do we have any time for questions? Yeah.
Of course, we're going to take time for questions. Yeah, thank you for ending. Please keep it short, Francisco.
I will. My question is about the compromising of the endpoint devices in P2P encryption. And in particular, consider the fact that it's well known that Windows source code is available to the Russian Chinese governments. So they actually have...
Windows what?
The source codes for Windows. A lot of governments have access to that. So have you had any thoughts about attacks on the end user device itself to then access the encryption keys?
Well, look, nobody who builds products like this, Signal, Silent Phone, WhatsApp, nobody wants to put in that feature into their product. In fact, and Apple doesn't want to do it either. They have FaceTime. By the way, FaceTime is encrypted end-to-end. It's not the same as the Signal protocol or mine, but they have some kind of end-to-end encryption. They don't want to put that in. And so you get strong opposition from the vendors who spent years developing these wonderful encryption protocols. So I don't think the market is going to allow it. I don't think the vendors are going to allow it. So just imagine if they passed a law like that, and then Apple wouldn't sell any more iPhones in that country. What would the voters in that country do if they couldn't buy any more iPhones? Because FaceTime is deeply embedded in the message, the text messaging protocol is end-to-end as well. I mean, the free market is never going to allow this. So I still think we'll win this renewal of this debate, a debate that I thought we'd already won in 25 years ago. But we have to push back. We can't allow this to happen.
Are there any technologies that you're particularly optimistic about in the next 5 to 10 years versus legislative or other solutions for doing that?
Well, I think that, I'm worried about the bigger picture of surveillance because if you look around today, so many of our democracies are in danger of toppling into autocracy. We see it everywhere. Hungary used to be a democracy. Right after the Cold War ended, Hungary was all optimistic and looking to the West, and they were enthusiastic about, getting out from under the Soviets. And so they were really pro-democracy. But now today, there's an autocrat running the country, and he got elected in a normal election, but then he used his executive power to seize control of all the different parts of the government, the courts, the election machinery, the press, academia, other civil society institutions, and it's almost impossible to beat him in an election. In Venezuela, they did beat him in an election by a landslide, like 2/3 of the vote. But then he threatened to imprison or kill the winner unless he got on this airplane and head out to Spain and sign a letter saying, I give up, you won, you won. So, encryption alone is not enough, but we need to organize politically against the emergent autocrats to try to beat them in the next election cycle. And you need to have end-to-end encryption to do that. Because if you don't, no political opposition can form. This is true in China. China has 1 billion video cameras with facial recognition software behind it, and they keep track of everybody's muscle twitches, every little facial expression, whoever you meet with, wherever you go, every little detail of your life. And that means it's impossible for an opposition political party to organize and try to win an election against the incumbent autocrat. And of course, the same is true in Putin's Russia. They don't have 1 billion cameras, but they try to match it with brutality. And autocrats, you might live in a democracy today, but you're only one election cycle away from possibly an autocrat taking power, and you can't start with backdoors in your end-to-end encryption. If you do, and that autocrat gets into power, you're going to have a tough time extracting him from getting him out of power.
Take 2 more questions from Sergio and then from Jens.
Do you think that one day we will have also confidential financial transactions, or that would never happen?
There are mathematical techniques to have confidential transactions. We see this in Monero and Zcash and maybe some others. And my feeling about that kind of depends on which environment you're in. If you're in a free country, you feel less motivated to have that than if you're living in an autocracy. Because in an autocracy, even a nice country, Singapore, I visited Singapore back in 2004 for some consulting work I was doing, and I'd heard that it was Disneyland with the death penalty. But when I got off the airplane and looked around, it kind of looked like a normal country. But it turns out that everybody there has their life savings and their pension under the control of the government. And if you criticize the government, they might take your money. So I have to admit that if you're in a place like that, it makes sense. And Bitcoin makes more sense. But I also worry about autocrats evading sanctions by using cryptocurrencies. And so I'm very much in favor of sanctions. So these, all of these things have mixed effects. PGP has mixed effects on society. PGP is in the Al-Qaeda training manual. I wish that were not the case, but it's true. But it does a lot of good as well, because most people who use PGP are normal people doing normal things. By the way, this has always been the case, going back to other technologies. 100 years ago, I told the story, I think I told the story last year, but you know, the
It would be great not to have a story and to go to another question, because we're...
okay, all right, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so just to tiny bit push back on what you said with regard to worrying about China, which I actually do as well, but at the same time, we can sort of work our way to exclude China from installing hardware or using Chinese hardware, but it's not like the NSA or BND, et cetera, stopped thinking about things like that or stopped wanting to do these things. Crypto AG, which was run by CIA
Oh yeah,
and BND
Crypto
until,
AG, yes. There's a story.
Yes, absolutely, or and many others. And so my concern was basically we still have to be very, very vigilant about our Western intelligence agencies still as well, because we have the chance to exclude China. We really...
Well, you know, look, I mean, Crypto AG was decades ago when, you know, before the internet, you know, and so a CIA-controlled company that builds encryption equipment could, you know, that was Crypto AG. But today, we have a multitude of products from everybody and running a zillion software apps on our platforms, and so it's, you know, we have a lot of powerful end-to-end crypto today. And we just have to not get too lazy to push back on, you know, we have to work in policy space. It's not just developing the technology, it's also pushing back in policy space. We have to be active. We have to be engaged in the democratic process. We have to vote. We have to, you know, write op-ed pieces. We have to go talk to our parliaments. And we, you know, we have to exercise control as much as we can in civil society. Sometimes that involves market forces. Don't buy products with back doors. And if you make products, don't sell products with back doors. So don't sell them in that country, because that country wants back doors. Go sell them everywhere else. Then let the voters in that country, if it's a really popular product like an iPhone, let them pressure their parliament.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us, Phil. I have one question on that note. What did you learn from the people that you met here at the Proof of Work Summit? Was anything new for you that you discovered?
Yeah, I think the most interesting conversations I had in the last couple of days is the energy usage. You know, I worry a lot about the climate change impact. And so finding ways to incentivize using other energy sources for Bitcoin mining, like especially stranded energy, that's quite attractive. But green energy, you know, that I did learn a lot, especially, you know, I mean, a couple of the presentations were from people that spent all their time on that.
And were you brought in touch with any new communication protocols or products while you were here?
I wasn't really looking for that. I was much more interested in the energy footprint, the carbon footprint.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Phil.
Okay.